A 92-year-old man in a faded army jacket barely grazes a motorcycle handlebar outside Murphy's Tavern in Elmwood Valley, Pennsylvania. And 30 seconds later, he's sprawled on the sidewalk, blood trickling from his lip, while the biker who struck him laughs with his friends, and an entire crowd keeps walking past without helping. What nobody knew about Harold Stewart that Thursday morning was that he earned 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart in Korea. And his daughter Sarah was a decorated Army colonel commanding a helicopter rescue unit just 15 miles away. 30 minutes after that punch landed, a Black Hawk helicopter descended onto Main Street with tactical teams pouring out. And suddenly everyone who had walked past that bleeding old man realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. This is the story of what happens when a small town discovers that some uniforms never really come off, when dignity doesn't retire at 92, and when a group of bikers learns that respect isn't earned through fear, but through understanding. The true cost of freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Elmwood Valley as Harold Stewart made his way toward the Blue Ridge Diner. His worn leather boots scraped against the concrete sidewalk with each deliberate step, the rubber sole of his left foot slightly dragging from an old shrapnel wound that never quite healed right. The faded olive-green army jacket hung loose on his diminished frame, patches of fabric worn thin at the elbows where decades of use had softened the material to the texture of old paper. Harold paused at the corner of Main and Elm, waiting for the single traffic light to cycle through its colors. A young mother pushing a stroller crossed in front of him, earbuds blocking out the world around her. She didn't notice the elderly man standing patiently, didn't see the small American flag pin attached to his jacket collar, didn't register the careful way he held himself upright, despite the tremor in his left hand. The walk to the diner took Harold nearly 20 minutes, though it would have taken most people 5. Each step required concentration. Each crack in the sidewalk demanded attention. His cane, a simple wooden stick with a worn brass handle, tapped a steady rhythm against the pavement. The sound echoed off the brick storefronts lining Main Street, mixing with the distant hum of morning traffic and the occasional rumble of delivery trucks making their rounds. Rita Palmer spotted Harold through the large plate glass window of the Blue Ridge Diner before he reached the front door. She had been expecting him since 7:30, knowing his routine as well as her own morning ritual of brewing the first pot of coffee. Rita wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the entrance, timing her approach to arrive just as Harold's arthritic fingers wrapped around the door handle. "Morning, Hal," Rita said, holding the door wide. "Table 6 is waiting for you." "Much obliged, Rita," Harold replied, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned to speak clearly, despite hearing that wasn't what it used to be. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Rita glanced toward the overcast sky, threatening rain, and smiled. Harold always found something beautiful about every morning, whether sunshine or storm clouds gathered overhead. She guided him toward his usual table by the window, where the morning light would be strongest, and he could watch the town wake up around him. The Blue Ridge Diner carried the worn comfort of a place that had served the same community for 30 years. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, their surfaces cracked but clean. The black and white checkered floor showed scuff marks from thousands of work boots and sneakers. Behind the counter, an ancient coffee machine gurgled and hissed, filling the air with the rich aroma that had greeted morning customers since the Carter administration. Harold settled into his booth with the careful movements of someone whose body required negotiation for every action. He placed his cane against the wall within easy reach and removed his jacket, folding it precisely before setting it on the seat beside him. Underneath, he wore a clean white shirt, pressed despite its age, and a thin black tie that had seen better decades, but still held its shape. "Coffee?" Rita asked, though she was already pouring from the pot she carried. "Please," Harold said, wrapping his weathered hands around the cup as she filled it. The warmth felt good against his palms, especially on mornings when the Pennsylvania chill seemed to settle into his bones and refuse to leave. Rita studied his face for a moment, noting the slight pallor that hadn't been there the week before. "You sleeping all right, Hal? You look a little tired." Harold sipped his coffee slowly, considering his response. He'd been having the dreams again, flashes of career that came without warning and left him sitting upright in his narrow bed at 3 in the morning. But Rita didn't need to carry that burden, didn't need to know about the nights when sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. "Just the weather changing," he said finally. "Makes the old joints complain a bit more than usual." The diner door chimed as other customers began filtering in for breakfast. Harold recognized most of them, faces he had been seeing around Elmwood Valley for the 12 years since he moved here after his wife Margaret passed. There was Frank Morrison, who ran the hardware store and always nodded politely but never stopped to talk. Susan Fletcher walked in with her teenage son Lucas, both of them checking their phones instead of speaking to each other. Harold watched the familiar patterns of his community through the window as Rita brought him his usual breakfast. 2 eggs, over easy wheat toast, and a side of grits that reminded him of mornings in basic training when the mess hall served similar fare to nervous young men who didn't yet understand what they were preparing for. Outside, Murphy's Tavern sat dark and quiet across the street. The old brick building had been serving drinks to Elmwood Valley for longer than Harold had been alive, though he rarely ventured inside. The establishment attracted a rougher crowd these days, men and women who worked construction or factory jobs and needed someplace to unwind after long shifts. Harold didn't judge them for their choices, but he preferred the quiet atmosphere of the diner to the loud conversations and cigarette smoke that spilled out of Murphy's front door. As Harold ate his breakfast, he noticed the motorcycles beginning to gather in the parking area beside Murphy's Tavern. It was Thursday, which meant the weekly gathering of the local biker group. Harold had seen them before, men mostly in their 30s and 40s, wearing leather vests and riding machines. They probably cost more than many people earned in a year. They weren't necessarily troublemakers, but their presence changed the atmosphere of Main Street, adding an edge of noise and swagger that made other residents walk a little faster past their gathering spot. "Those boys are starting early today," Rita observed, following Harold's gaze toward the growing collection of motorcycles. "Different ways of finding fellowship," Harold replied diplomatically. He had learned long ago not to judge people by their appearance or their choice of transportation. Some of the finest soldiers he had served with looked nothing like what civilians expected heroes to look like. Harold finished his breakfast without hurrying, savoring each bite and the simple pleasure of a hot meal in comfortable surroundings. When he was ready to leave, Rita brought him his check, though the amount never seemed to reflect the actual cost of his meal. Harold suspected she had been quietly reducing his bill for months, but he never questioned her arithmetic. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford on his fixed income, and Rita's kindness was a gift he had learned to accept gracefully. He left exact change, plus a tip that was probably too generous for his budget, but felt right for the service Rita provided. She helped him back into his jacket and handed him his cane, watching as he prepared for the walk home. The motorcycles were louder now, engines revving as more riders arrived for their weekly gathering. Harold could see Jake Porter, the group's apparent leader, gesturing broadly as he told some story that had the others laughing. Tank, as most people called him, was a large man with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He commanded attention through sheer physical presence and a voice that carried across the parking lot, even over the sound of motorcycle engines. Harold pushed through the diner door and began his careful journey home. The walk would take him directly past Murphy's Tavern and the growing crowd of bikers, but it was the most direct route, and Harold had never been one to take the long way around simply to avoid other people. The morning air had grown cooler and Harold pulled his jacket tighter around his chest as he made his way down Main Street. His cane tapped its familiar rhythm against the sidewalk, marking time like a metronome set to the pace of advanced age and old injuries that never quite healed properly. As he approached Murphy's Tavern, Harold could hear the conversation among the bikers more clearly. They were planning some kind of ride for the weekend, discussing routes and stops with the enthusiasm of people who had found something they genuinely enjoyed. Harold respected that kind of passion, even if he didn't understand the appeal of motorcycles. Everyone needed something that brought them joy, something that made them feel alive and connected to others who shared their interests. He was almost past the gathering when his jacket caught on something. Harold felt the tug and stopped immediately, turning to see what had happened. His coat had brushed against the handlebar of a gleaming black motorcycle, the fabric catching on a chrome mirror that jutted out from the bike's side. Harold carefully disentangled his jacket from the mirror, taking care not to disturb the motorcycle's position or damage anything. He ran his hand along the chrome to make sure he hadn't left any marks, then stepped back and looked around to see if anyone had noticed the minor contact. Tank Porter had noticed. He was walking toward Harold with the measured stride of someone accustomed to having other people move out of his way. Behind him, several other bikers had stopped their conversations to watch what would happen next. "You got a problem with my bike, old man?" Tank's voice carried the edge of someone looking for a reason to be offended. Harold raised both hands in a gesture of peace, his cane hanging from his wrist by its leather strap. "No problem at all, son. My jacket just caught on your mirror there. Didn't mean any harm." The explanation was reasonable, delivered in a calm voice by someone who clearly posed no threat to anyone. Harold had apologized, shown respect, and tried to defuse whatever tension might be building. In a rational world, that would have been the end of the encounter. But Tank Porter wasn't operating from a place of rationality. He was operating from a place of anger that had been building for weeks, fed by job frustrations and personal disappointments that had nothing to do with Harold Stewart. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to take the weight of his accumulated resentment, and the old man in the faded army jacket had just provided the perfect target. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Tank Porter took another step closer to Harold, his boots heavy against the asphalt parking lot. The other bikers formed a loose semicircle behind him, their conversations dying as they sensed the shift in atmosphere. Harold remained where he stood, both hands still raised in a peaceful gesture, his weathered face showing no fear despite the growing tension. "That's a custom paint job," Tank said, running his finger along the motorcycle's fuel tank. "Cost me $3,000 to get it just right. You sure you didn't scratch it?" Harold leaned forward slightly, squinting at the chrome mirror where his jacket had made contact. The surface gleamed without a mark, reflecting the gray morning sky in perfect clarity. "I don't see any damage, son, but if there is something, I'd be happy to make it right." Bobby Bishop, Tank's lieutenant, stepped up beside his leader. "Maybe the old guy needs glasses," he said with a smirk. "Can't tell if he's scratching bikes or not." A few of the other bikers chuckled, but the laughter felt forced, as if they weren't entirely comfortable with the direction the confrontation was heading. Harold noticed the uncertainty in some of their faces, the way a couple of them glanced toward the diner across the street where other people were going about their morning routines. "Look, I understand you're protective of your motorcycle," Harold said, his voice steady and respectful. "It's a beautiful machine. I was a mechanic myself, back in the service. I know how much work goes into keeping something like this in perfect condition." Tank's expression didn't soften at Harold's attempt to find common ground. If anything, the mention of military service seemed to irritate him further. "Oh, we got ourselves a war hero," he said loudly enough for the entire group to hear. "Let me guess, World War II, Korea, Vietnam?" "Korea," Harold replied simply, not boasting but not hiding either. "My old man was in Vietnam," Tank continued, his voice growing harder. "Came back all messed up in the head. Spent 20 years drinking himself to death because of what the army did to him. So excuse me if I'm not impressed by your service record. Grandpa?" Harold absorbed this information without flinching. He had known other veterans who came home broken, men who couldn't find their way back to the world they had left behind. The pain in Tank's voice was real, even if it was being misdirected towards someone who had nothing to do with his father's suffering. "I'm sorry about your father," Harold said quietly. "War takes different tolls on different men. Some of us are lucky enough to find our way home, others aren't." The sincerity in Harold's response seemed to catch Tank off guard for a moment. His aggressive posture wavered slightly, as if he hadn't expected understanding from his target, but the moment of uncertainty passed quickly, replaced by renewed hostility. "Save your sympathy," Tank snapped. "Just watch where you're walking next time." Harold nodded and began to turn away, ready to continue his walk home. The confrontation could have ended there, should have ended there, with words exchanged and no real harm done. But as Harold took his first step toward the sidewalk, Tank's voice stopped him. "Hold on there, soldier boy, we're not done talking." Harold turned back patiently, though he could feel the situation escalating beyond reasonable bounds. Around them, morning traffic continued to flow down Main Street. People walked past on the sidewalk, some glancing toward the gathering, but none stopping to observe closely. The bikers' presence was familiar enough that most residents simply navigated around them without giving much thought to what was happening. "I think we've said what needs saying," Harold replied calmly. "I apologize for the contact with your bike. No damage was done. I'll be more careful in the future." Tank moved closer. Close enough that Harold could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "See, that's the problem with you military types. Always think you can just walk away when you're done talking, like you're better than everybody else." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Harold said. "I just don't see the point in continuing this conversation." Bobby Bishop laughed harshly. "Hear that, Tank? Old-timer thinks he gets to decide when we're done." Harold felt the circle of bikers tightening around him, though they maintained enough distance to avoid making the confrontation obviously threatening to any casual observers. He had been in situations like this before, many decades ago in places far from Pennsylvania, and he recognized the dynamics at work. Tank needed to establish dominance in front of his group, needed to prove something to men who looked to him for leadership. "You know what I think?" Tank said, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow felt more dangerous than his earlier aggression. "I think you old-timers had it easy. All that greatest generation nonsense. You fought your nice, clean war with clear-cut enemies and came home to parades and hero worship." Harold considered this perspective carefully before responding. "Every generation faces its own battles," he said. "I won't claim mine were harder or easier than anyone else's." "Diplomatic answer," Tank said. "Very safe, very careful. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You people never had to deal with the real world, the way things actually work." From inside Murphy's tavern, Emma Tucker watched the growing confrontation through the front window. She had opened early to prep for lunch service and noticed the bikers gathering in their usual spot. The conversation looked heated, though she couldn't hear the words being exchanged. Emma considered stepping outside to check on the situation, but the bikers were regular customers who brought steady business, and she didn't want to create unnecessary drama over what might be a simple misunderstanding. Harold shifted his weight slightly, easing the pressure on his left leg where the old shrapnel wound was beginning to ache. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable, but Tank seized on it as if Harold had made some aggressive gesture. "Getting antsy, old man? Somewhere important you need to be?" "Just heading home," Harold replied. "Wife's expecting me back soon." It was a lie. Margaret had been gone for 12 years, but Harold hoped the mention of a waiting spouse might remind these men that he was someone's husband, someone's father, a person with connections and value beyond whatever threat they imagined he represented. Tank glanced at the thin gold band on Harold's left hand, then back up at his face. "Married long?" 47 years, Harold said, the number coming automatically despite the deception. "Must be nice," Tank said, though his tone suggested anything but warmth. "Having someone to go home to, someone who gives a damn whether you show up or not." Harold heard the loneliness beneath the hostility and felt a genuine moment of sympathy for the younger man. Tank's anger wasn't really about a motorcycle or military service or generational differences. It was about isolation and disappointment, about watching life happen to other people while feeling left behind. "There's someone out there for everyone," Harold offered gently. "Sometimes it just takes longer to find them." The kindness in his voice seemed to infuriate Tank rather than calm him. "Don't you dare," he said, pointing a thick finger at Harold's chest. "Don't you stand there and give me life advice like you know anything about my situation." "You're right," Harold said immediately. "I don't know your situation. I was just trying to be helpful." "Well, don't," Tank snapped. "Keep your help to yourself." Harold nodded and again started to turn away, but this time Tank reached out and grabbed his arm. The grip was firm, but not immediately painful, more of a restraint than an attack. Still, the physical contact crossed a line that words alone had. "Not. I said we weren't done talking," Tank said. Harold looked down at the hand on his arm, then back up at Tank's face. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let go of me, son." "Or what? You'll call the cops? File a complaint? Get me in trouble with the authorities?" The other bikers had moved closer now, forming a tighter circle around Harold and their leader. None of them looked entirely comfortable with how the situation was developing, but group dynamics and loyalty to Tank kept them from speaking up or walking away. Harold could see people moving along the sidewalks and in and out of the shops along Main Street. A few had noticed the gathering around the motorcycles, but none showed any inclination to intervene. It was the kind of willful blindness that allowed communities to function smoothly most of the time. The assumption that other people's conflicts were not their responsibility. "I just want to go home," Harold said quietly. "I'm not looking for trouble with you or anyone else." Tank studied Harold's face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the old man was showing appropriate deference or simply being stubborn in a polite way. The grip on Harold's arm tightened slightly. "Here's what's going to happen," Tank said. "You're going to apologize for touching my bike. Not the half-hearted sorry you gave before, but a real apology. Then you're going to promise to walk on the side of the street from now on, so we don't have any more accidents." Harold felt the weight of 9 sets of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to this demand for submission. In another life, 40 years younger and surrounded by different men, his response might have been very different. But he was 92 years old, alone, and facing a group of people who clearly weren't interested in reasonable conversation. "I apologize for any inconvenience I caused," Harold said clearly. "It won't happen again." Tank smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "See, that wasn't so hard. Shows you got some sense after all." He released Harold's arm and stepped back slightly, but the circle of bikers remained close enough to prevent easy escape. Harold rubbed his arm where Tank's fingers had gripped it, feeling the bruise that would certainly develop by evening. "Can I go now?" Harold asked. Tank made a show of considering the question, drawing out the moment to demonstrate his control over the situation. "Yeah," he said finally. "You can go." But remember what we talked about. Other side of the street. Harold nodded and began walking toward the sidewalk, his cane tapping against the asphalt with each careful step. Behind him, he could hear the bikers laughing and resuming their conversations, the tension dissolving now that their leader had established his dominance over the harmless old man. As Harold reached the sidewalk, he heard Tank's voice calling, "After him one more time." "Hey, soldier boy." Harold stopped and turned around reluctantly. "Thank you for your service," Tank said with exaggerated sincerity, prompting another round of laughter from his companions. Harold didn't respond to the mockery. He simply turned back toward home and continued walking, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had just endured. Each step carried him further from the confrontation, but the weight of what had just happened settled into his chest like a stone. The walk home took longer than usual, partly because Harold's left leg was bothering him more after standing still for so long, and partly because he found himself pausing frequently to catch his breath. The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not because of any physical threat, but because of the casual cruelty he had witnessed. As he walked, Harold reflected on Tank's words about his father, about the damage that military service had inflicted on an earlier generation. The young man's pain was real, even if his way of expressing it was misdirected and harmful. Harold had known soldiers like Tank's father, men who came home from war carrying invisible wounds that never properly healed. But understanding Tank's motivations didn't excuse his behavior or make the humiliation any easier to bear. Harold had served his country honorably, had earned the right to walk down any street in America without being threatened or mocked. The fact that he had chosen to avoid further confrontation didn't diminish his courage. It simply reflected the practical reality of being 92 years old and alone. By the time Harold reached his small house on Maple Street, the morning's encounter had settled into a dull ache that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. He climbed the 3 steps to his front porch slowly, using his key to unlock the door and stepping into the quiet sanctuary of his home. The house felt especially empty after the intensity of the confrontation, filled with the kind of silence that only comes from living alone. Harold hung his jacket on the hook beside the front door and made his way to the kitchen, where he put water on for tea and sat down at the small table to process what had just happened. He thought about calling someone, sharing the burden of the morning's events with another person who might understand or offer comfort. But the list of people in his life was short, and most of them were dealing with their own challenges. Rita would be sympathetic, but would worry unnecessarily about his safety. His daughter Sarah was busy with her military responsibilities and didn't need additional concerns about her father's well-being. So Harold sat alone in his kitchen, drinking tea and watching the rain that had finally begun to fall against his window, washing the streets of Elmwood Valley clean of everything except the memory of what had happened outside Murphy's Tavern. 3 days passed before Harold ventured back onto Main Street. The bruise on his arm had deepened to a mottled purple, hidden beneath the sleeves of his shirts, but serving as a constant reminder of Thursday's encounter. He had spent the weekend in his house, reading old letters from Margaret and avoiding the need to walk past Murphy's Tavern. But Monday morning brought the necessity of grocery shopping. Harold's refrigerator had grown nearly empty, and his pride wouldn't allow him to ask Rita or anyone else to shop for him simply because he feared another confrontation with Tank Porter and his friends. Harold dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue cardigan instead of his usual army jacket. The change felt like a small betrayal of his own history, but practicality outweighed sentiment. He tucked his wallet into his front pocket, picked up his shopping list, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The walk to Peterson's Market took him directly past Murphy's Tavern, just as it had every Monday for 12 years. Harold had considered taking the longer route down Elm Street, honoring the promise Tank had forced from him about staying on the other side of the street. But something in his chest rebelled against the idea of allowing intimidation to dictate his movements through his own community. As Harold approached the tavern, he was relieved to see the parking area empty of motorcycles. The bikers typically gathered on Thursday evenings and weekend afternoons, leaving Monday mornings peaceful for regular pedestrians. Harold maintained his usual pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, his cane marking steady time against the sidewalk. Inside Peterson's Market, Harold selected his groceries with the careful attention of someone living on a fixed income. A small container of milk, enough bread for the week, coffee, and a few canned goods that would stretch through several meals. At the checkout counter, young Ashley Peterson helped him bag his purchases, chatting about the weather and asking politely about his weekend. "Did you do anything special, Mr. Stewart?" Ashley asked as she counted his change. "Just some reading," Harold replied. "Sometimes the quiet weekends are the best ones." Ashley smiled and handed him his grocery bag. "Well, you have a good rest of your week. See you next Monday." Harold thanked her and made his way toward the exit, feeling satisfied with the simple normalcy of the interaction. The grocery shopping had gone smoothly, and he was beginning to think that Thursday's incident might have been an isolated occurrence, a moment of poor judgment that wouldn't be repeated. As he pushed through the market's front door, Harold nearly collided with a solid figure entering from the opposite direction. He looked up to find himself face to face with Bobby Bishop, Tank's lieutenant from the motorcycle group. Bobby carried a case of beer under one arm and wore the same leather vest he had sported during Thursday's confrontation. "Well, look who it is," Bobby said, blocking Harold's path through the doorway. "The war hero's back on Main Street." Harold stepped to one side, trying to navigate around Bobby without creating a scene. "Excuse me," he said politely. Bobby shifted his weight, maintaining the obstruction. "Thought Tank told you to stick to the other side of the street. Memory problems, old man?" "The market's on this side," Harold replied calmly. "I needed groceries." "Lots of markets in this town," Bobby said. "Maybe you should find one that doesn't require you to break your promises." Harold felt other customers building up behind him, people who wanted to enter or exit the store, but were being prevented by Bobby's deliberate blocking of the doorway. The situation was becoming a public spectacle, exactly what Harold had hoped to avoid. "I'm not looking for trouble," Harold said quietly, "just trying to get my shopping done." Bobby's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "See, that's where you and I disagree. I think you're looking for trouble. I think you came down here hoping to run into us again." "That's not true," Harold said. "Prove it," Bobby replied. "Turn around and walk back the way you came. Use the exit on Elm Street. Show everyone here that you respect what Tank told you." Harold glanced over Bobby's shoulder and saw several people waiting impatiently to enter the store. A young mother with two small children looked particularly frustrated, shifting her weight from foot to foot while her toddler began to fuss. Harold realized that his refusal to comply with Bobby's demand was inconveniencing innocent people who had nothing to do with this conflict. "All right," Harold said finally. "I'll go around." Bobby stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, sweeping his arm toward the interior of the store. "After you, Grandpa." Harold turned and walked back through the market, past the checkout counters, and down the center aisle toward the rear exit that opened onto Elm Street. Behind him, he could hear Bobby's boots following at a deliberate pace, making sure the humiliation was complete and witnessed by as many people as possible. The rear exit deposited Harold into the alley behind Peterson's Market, a narrow space. lined with dumpsters and delivery trucks. The smell of rotting vegetables and diesel exhaust filled the air as Harold made his way toward Elm Street, his grocery bag clutched tightly in his free hand. Bobby had followed him into the alley, apparently not content to let the matter end with Harold's compliance. "You know what your problem is," Bobby called out as Harold walked away. "You think you're entitled to special treatment because you wore a uniform 70 years ago." Harold stopped walking but didn't turn around. "I don't think I'm entitled to anything special, just common courtesy." "Common courtesy," Bobby repeated mockingly. "That's rich, coming from someone who can't follow simple instructions." Harold resumed walking, hoping Bobby would lose interest and return to his beer shopping. But the younger man continued to follow, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each step. "Tank's been talking about you all weekend," Bobby said. "Wondering if you learned your lesson or if you're just too stupid to understand plain English." Harold reached the mouth of the alley where it intersected with Elm Street. Traffic moved steadily in both directions, and pedestrians walked along the sidewalks, going about their Monday morning business. Harold felt safer in the more public space, less vulnerable to the kind of intimidation that thrived in isolated locations. But Bobby wasn't finished. As Harold stepped onto the sidewalk, the biker grabbed his shoulder and spun him around with enough force to make Harold stumble backward against a parked car. "Don't walk away when I'm talking to you," Bobby snarled. Harold's grocery bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the pavement with a soft thud. A can of soup rolled into the gutter while his bread was crushed beneath the weight of the milk container. Harold looked down at his scattered groceries, then back up at Bobby's angry face. "That wasn't necessary," Harold said, bending slowly to retrieve what he could salvage. Bobby kicked the bread loaf further down the sidewalk. "Maybe next time you'll listen better." A woman walking her dog on the opposite side of the street noticed the commotion and slowed her pace, clearly uncertain whether she should intervene. Harold caught her eye and shook his head slightly, not wanting to draw anyone else into Bobby's sphere of aggression. The woman hesitated for a moment, then continued walking with frequent glances back over her shoulder. Harold managed to recover most of his groceries, though the bread was ruined and the milk container had developed a small crack that was beginning to leak. He straightened up carefully, his back protesting the repeated bending, and faced Bobby with as much dignity as he could maintain. "Are we done here?" Harold asked. Bobby studied him for a moment, as if considering whether additional humiliation was necessary. "Yeah," he said finally, "we're done. But next time Tank gives you an order, you better follow it. He's not as patient as I am." Bobby turned and walked back toward the alley, leaving Harold standing alone beside the parked car with his damaged groceries and his damaged pride. Harold watched him go, then began the longer walk home via Elm Street, avoiding Main Street as he had been commanded to do. The house felt like a refuge when Harold finally reached it, though the sanctuary was tinged with the bitter taste of defeat. He unpacked his groceries in the kitchen, throwing away the ruined bread and transferring the leaking milk to a bowl to prevent it from spoiling completely. The simple act of putting food away became a meditation on the small humiliations that were apparently to be his new reality in Elmwood Valley. Harold sat at his kitchen table and considered his options. He could report the incidents to the police, but what law had actually been broken? Bobby had pushed him and kicked his groceries, but no real violence had occurred. The encounters were more about intimidation and disrespect than criminal assault, existing in a gray area where official intervention seemed unlikely to help. He could avoid Main Street entirely, shopping at different stores and finding alternate routes through town. But that solution felt like allowing Tank and his followers to control Harold's movements, to dictate where he could and couldn't go in his own community. The principle of the thing mattered more than the practical inconvenience. Harold opened the drawer where he kept important papers and pulled out a small address book with worn leather covers. He flipped to the page marked with the letter S and found the entry he was looking for, Sarah Stewart Gonzalez, followed by a Fort Indian Town Gap address and 2 phone numbers. His daughter called him every Sunday evening, their weekly conversation, a highlight of Harold's otherwise quiet routine. Sarah always asked about his health, his activities, and whether he needed anything. Harold always assured her that he was fine, that Elmwood Valley was treating him well, that she shouldn't worry about her old father living alone. Harold stared at the phone numbers for a long time, his finger tracing the carefully written digits. Sarah was busy with her military responsibilities, commanding a helicopter unit that responded to emergencies across 3 counties. She didn't need additional stress about neighborhood bullies harassing her father over trivial disputes about sidewalk usage. But as Harold sat in his quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his morning's humiliation, he realized that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to manage alone. Tank Porter wasn't going to be satisfied with verbal intimidation and minor harassment. There was something in the biker's anger that suggested a need for greater dominance, for more complete submission than Harold was prepared to provide. Harold picked up his phone and scrolled through the contact list until he found the entry marked Emergency Eagle 6. It was a number Sarah had given him years ago, with strict instructions to use it only in genuine emergencies when his regular attempts to reach her had failed. Harold had never used the number, had never felt that his problems were serious enough to warrant interrupting his daughter's military duties. But staring at Bobby Bishop's threats and Tank Porter's escalating hostility, Harold began to wonder if that threshold had finally been crossed. The encounters were becoming more frequent and more aggressive, suggesting a pattern that would continue to intensify until some form of resolution was reached. Harold set the phone aside without making the call, but he didn't delete the number or put the address book away. Instead, he left both items on the kitchen table where he could see them, a reminder that he wasn't as powerless or as isolated as Tank Porter believed him to be. Outside his kitchen window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his small backyard. Harold watched a cardinal land on his bird feeder, its bright red plumage a splash of color against the gray autumn sky. The bird ate peacefully for several minutes before flying away, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts and his growing certainty that Thursday's confrontation was far from over. The bruise on his arm had begun to fade, but Harold suspected it would soon be replaced by others. Tank Porter had found a target for his anger, and men like Tank rarely lost interest in their prey until something forced them to stop. Harold could continue to submit and hope the harassment would eventually end, or he could take steps to ensure that it ended on his terms rather than theirs. For the first time in 12 years, Harold Stewart began to consider the possibility that his quiet retirement in Elmwood Valley was about to become considerably less quiet. Thursday arrived with an overcast sky that matched Harold's mood as he prepared for his weekly visit to the Blue Ridge Diner. The past 3 days had been spent largely indoors, avoiding the possibility of another encounter with Tank's group. But Thursday morning meant breakfast with Rita, a routine that Harold wasn't prepared to abandon despite the growing tension on Main Street. Harold chose his clothing carefully, selecting a brown wool sweater instead of anything that might identify him as a veteran. He left his cane behind, deciding that the slight unsteadiness was preferable to appearing more vulnerable than necessary. The walk to the diner would be manageable without it, and he could use the booth's support when he needed to rest. The morning air carried the smell of rain as Harold made his way down Maple Street toward Main. He had planned his route to approach the diner from the north, minimizing his time in front of Murphy's Tavern. The strategy worked until he was within 2 blocks of his destination, when the distant rumble of motorcycle engines announced that his timing had been unfortunate. Harold paused at the corner of Main and Pine, watching as the familiar group of bikers assembled in their usual gathering spot. Tank Porter was already there, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to Bobby Bishop and 3 other men whose names Harold didn't know. Their weekly meeting was starting earlier than usual, robbing Harold of the window of safety he had counted on. For a moment, Harold considered turning back, returning home, and postponing his breakfast until Friday. But the thought of allowing fear to dictate his actions rankled against everything he had been taught about facing adversity. Margaret used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right, despite being afraid. Harold crossed Pine Street and continued toward the diner, walking steadily, but not hurrying. He kept his eyes forward, avoiding direct eye contact with the bikers while remaining aware of their positions and movements. The group appeared to be focused on their own conversation, paying no attention to the elderly man making his way down the opposite sidewalk. Rita spotted Harold through the diner window and waved, her smile visible even from across the street. The gesture of friendship felt like an anchor in the uncertainty of the morning, reminding Harold that he still had allies in Elmwood Valley, even if they were unaware of his current difficulties. Harold pushed through the diner's front door and felt the familiar comfort of warm air and coffee aromas. Rita approached with the coffee pot already in hand, her expression showing the mild concern that had become more frequent during their recent encounters. "You're a little later than usual this morning," Rita observed, as she guided Harold to his regular table. "Slept in a bit," Harold replied, settling into the red vinyl booth with careful movements. "These old bones don't like the cold weather as much as they used to." Rita poured his coffee and studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who had been serving customers for 30 years. "You feeling all right, Hal? You look like something's bothering you." Harold considered telling Rita about his encounters with Tank and Bobby, sharing the burden of worry with someone who might understand or offer advice. But Rita was a 62-year-old woman who worked for tips and couldn't afford to alienate customers, even customers who might be causing problems for her friend. Harold decided to keep his troubles to himself. "Just tired," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. "Nothing a good breakfast won't fix." Rita nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. She took his order and returned to the kitchen, leaving Harold to watch the morning activity on Main Street through the large plate glass window. The bikers were still gathered around their motorcycles, their conversation apparently serious enough to require frequent gesturing and head nodding. Harold ate his breakfast slowly, savoring the eggs and toast while keeping one eye on the group. Across the street, several other customers came and went during his meal, their presence providing a comforting sense of normalcy to the morning. Frank Morrison stopped by Harold's table briefly, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the upcoming election before moving on to conduct his own business. As Harold finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he noticed that the biker group had grown larger. 2 additional motorcycles had arrived, bringing the total to 7 machines and their riders. Tank appeared to be holding court, speaking with animated gestures, while the others listened with the attention of people receiving important instructions. Harold paid his check and left his usual generous tip for Rita, who helped him back into his sweater and walked him to the door. The simple kindness of her assistance reminded Harold of Margaret's gentle care during the final years of her life, when his independence had begun to require support from others. "You take care of yourself, Hal," Rita said as she held the door open, "and don't be a stranger if you need anything." Harold thanked her and stepped onto the sidewalk, immediately feeling the weight of multiple pairs of eyes turning in his direction. The biker group had noticed his emergence from the diner, and their conversation had shifted from whatever business they had been discussing to the more immediate matter of the elderly man who had defied Tank's instructions about avoiding Main Street. Harold began walking north toward Pine Street, planning to take the longer route home via Elm Street. The strategy might have worked if Tank hadn't decided that Harold's presence on Main Street represented a direct challenge to his authority that required immediate response. "Hey there, soldier boy!" Tank's voice carried easily across the street, loud enough to draw attention from other pedestrians and shop owners. "Thought we had an understanding about your walking routes." Harold continued walking without acknowledging the call, hoping that Tank would be satisfied with making his point publicly and wouldn't escalate the situation further. But Tank was already crossing the street, his heavy boots striking the asphalt. With purposeful steps, "Don't ignore me when I'm talking to you," Tank shouted, his voice growing closer. Harold stopped and turned around, realizing that attempting to avoid the confrontation would only make it worse. Tank approached with Bobby Bishop and two other bikers flanking him, their formation designed to intimidate and control. Behind them, the remaining members of the group watched from across the street, ready to provide support if needed. "I was just leaving," Harold said calmly. "No trouble intended." "But there is trouble," Tank replied, stopping close enough that Harold could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "The trouble is, you thinking you can ignore what I tell you to do." "I needed breakfast," Harold explained. "The diner's been my regular spot for 12 years. Tank smiled, but the expression contained no warmth or humor. "See, that's your problem right there. You think your little routines matter more than showing proper respect to people who've made their position clear." A small crowd was beginning to gather, people drawn by the raised voices and the obvious tension between the elderly man and the group of bikers. Harold noticed Emma Tucker standing in the doorway of Murphy's Tavern, her expression uncertain as she watched the confrontation develop. Several other shop owners had appeared in their doorways, curious about the disturbance but reluctant to become involved. "I meant no disrespect," Harold said. "I was just trying to get breakfast and go home." "Wrong answer," Tank replied. "The right answer is, I'm sorry for disobeying your instructions and it won't happen again." "Let's hear that." Harold felt the familiar weight of forced submission, the demand for public humiliation that had become Tank's preferred method of establishing dominance. Around them, the crowd continued to grow, creating an audience for whatever Tank had planned. "I apologize," Harold said quietly. "It won't happen again." Tank cupped his ear theatrically. "What was that? I don't think everyone heard you." "I said I apologize," Harold repeated louder this time. "It won't happen again." Tank nodded with satisfaction. "Better. But I think you need a reminder about following instructions, something that'll help you remember next time you're tempted to ignore what I tell you." Harold felt his chest tighten with the recognition that the situation was about to escalate. Beyond verbal humiliation, Tank's body language had shifted into something more aggressive, more purposeful, and the other bikers had moved closer in a formation that would prevent Harold from retreating. "Please," Harold said, "I've apologized. I'll stay away from Main Street. There's no need for anything more." Tank shook his head slowly. "See, that's where you're wrong, old man. There's definitely a need for something more. You've been disrespectful. Twice now, and disrespect has consequences." Bobby Bishop stepped closer to Harold's left side, while another biker, a thin man with prison tattoos covering his forearms, moved to Harold's right. The formation trapped Harold between them and Tank, creating a pocket of space hidden from most of the watching crowd. "What are you going to do?" Harold asked, though he was beginning to understand that the question was rhetorical. "I'm going to teach you a lesson about respect," Tank replied, "something you should have learned a long time ago." Tank drew back his right hand and struck Harold across the face with an open palm, the slap echoing off the brick buildings lining Main Street. Harold staggered backward, his hand instinctively rising to his stinging cheek, but the bikers on either side prevented him from falling or retreating. The crowd's reaction was immediate, but muted. Several people gasped or exclaimed in surprise, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Cell phones appeared in some hands, but whether to call for help or record the incident wasn't clear. The paralysis of bystander shock had settled over the gathering, creating a bubble of inaction around the escalating violence. Harold straightened up slowly, his left cheek burning from the impact, and his pride stung more than his face. "That was unnecessary," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Was it?" Tank asked. "I don't think so. I think it was exactly what was necessary to get your attention." Tank struck Harold again, this time with a closed fist that caught him in the stomach and doubled him over with pain. Harold gasped for breath, his hands clutching his midsection as he fought to remain upright. The impact had been precisely calculated to cause maximum discomfort without creating visible injury that might complicate Tank's legal situation. "Getting the message now?" Tank asked, leaning close to Harold's ear. "Or do we need to continue this education?" Harold straightened up with enormous effort, his face pale but his expression determined. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, but remained passive, their collective inaction serving as tacit permission for Tank's violence to continue. "I understand," Harold whispered, the words forced out through pain and diminished breath. Tank smiled and patted Harold's shoulder with mock friendliness. "Good. I knew you were smart enough to learn if the lesson was presented clearly." Tank stepped back and gestured to his companions, indicating that the demonstration was complete. The bikers relaxed their formation, allowing Harold space to breathe and recover from the assault. But the damage had been done, both physical and psychological, creating a public spectacle of humiliation that would be remembered by everyone present. Harold stood in the center of the dispersing crowd, alone, despite being surrounded by people, his dignity stripped away in front of his own community. The pain in his stomach was manageable, but the ache in his chest felt like something fundamental had been broken beyond repair. As the bikers walked back toward their motorcycles, laughing and congratulating each other on their successful intimidation, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His fingers trembled as he scrolled through the contact list, past Rita's number and the doctor's office and the taxi service, until he found the entry marked Emergency, Eagle 6. Harold looked around at the faces of people who had watched him, being assaulted without lifting a finger to help, people who were already beginning to disperse as if nothing significant had happened. Then he pressed the call button and raised the phone to his ear. The call connected on the second ring, answered by a crisp military voice that Harold recognized despite not having heard it in over a year. "Eagle 6, this is Colonel Stuart Gonzalez." "Sarah," Harold said quietly, "it's your father. I think I need some help." "Sarah, it's your father. I think I need some help." The words hung in the air between Fort Indiantown Gap and Main Street Elmwood Valley, carrying weight that Sarah Stewart Gonzalez recognized immediately. In 30 years of military service, she had heard that particular tone in her father's voice exactly twice. Once when her mother was dying, and once when he had fallen and broken his hip at age 87. "Dad, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" Sarah's voice shifted from official military bearing to urgent parental concern in the space of a heartbeat. Harold looked around at the dispersing crowd, at Tank and his bikers mounting their motorcycles with the satisfaction of a job well done, at the shop owners retreating into their businesses as if nothing had happened. His stomach still ached from Tank's punch, but the physical pain was secondary to the deeper wound of being abandoned by his own community. "I've been having some trouble with a local group," Harold said carefully, not wanting to alarm Sarah unnecessarily, but needing her to understand the seriousness of the situation. "It escalated this morning. I think I'm out of my depth here." Sarah's mind immediately began processing tactical information. Her father was careful with words, never given to exaggeration or unnecessary drama. If Harold Stewart was calling for help, the situation was genuinely serious. "Where are you now, Dad?" "Main Street, outside the Blue Ridge Diner. There are still people around." "Good. Stay where there are witnesses. Don't go home alone. Can you get to a safe location and wait for me?" Harold considered the question. The diner would be safe, with Rita and other customers providing security through their presence. But returning there would mean walking past Tank's group again, potentially triggering another confrontation. "I can manage that," Harold said. "Do it now. I'm 20 minutes out." The line went dead, leaving Harold holding a silent phone while Tank's motorcycle roared to life across the street. Harold tucked the phone into his pocket and began walking back toward the Blue Ridge Diner, each step carefully measured to avoid showing weakness or fear to anyone who might still be watching. Rita met him at the diner door, her face creased with worry and anger. "Hal, what happened out there? I saw those men around you, but I couldn't see clearly through the window." "Just a misunderstanding," Harold replied, though the bruise forming on his cheek suggested otherwise. "Could I sit down for a few minutes?" "My daughter's coming to pick me up." Rita guided Harold to a booth in the back corner, away from the front windows and the view of Main Street. She brought him coffee without being asked and sat down across from him with the protective posture of someone who had spent decades watching out for people who needed help. "Hal, that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was assault. Did you call the police?" Harold shook his head. "I called my daughter. She'll know what to do." Rita studied Harold's face, noting the careful way he held himself and the slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Your daughter's a teacher, isn't she? Elementary school?" "No," Harold said quietly. "Military, Army colonel. She commands a helicopter unit at Fort Indiantown Gap." Rita's eyebrows rose in surprise. Harold had never mentioned his daughter's military service during their many breakfast conversations, preferring to talk about Sarah's childhood or her academic achievements rather than her professional accomplishments. "A colonel," Rita repeated. "That's impressive. What kind of helicopters?" "Search and rescue mostly. Medical evacuations. Emergency response." Harold paused, then added, "She's very good at her job." Meanwhile, 15 miles away at Fort Indiantown Gap, Colonel Sarah Stewart Gonzalez was rapidly transforming from concerned daughter to commanding officer responding to a family emergency. She strode across the helicopter hangar with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to making quick decisions under pressure. "Master Sergeant Thompson," Sarah called out to her crew chief, who was conducting a routine maintenance inspection on their primary Black Hawk. "Emergency family situation. How fast can we be airborne?" Master Sergeant David Thompson looked up from the checklist he was reviewing, immediately reading the urgency in his colonel's voice and posture. "Birds fully fueled and green across the board, ma'am. 5 minutes if we skip the extended pre-flight." "Do it! And Thompson, full tactical crew. I don't know what we're walking into." Thompson nodded and began issuing rapid orders to the maintenance crew. Within minutes, the hangar filled with the purposeful activity of military personnel preparing for an emergency deployment. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez emerged from the crew building, already dressed in flight gear and carrying her helmet. "What's our destination, Colonel?" Gonzalez asked as she joined Sarah beside the helicopter. "Elmwood Valley. My father's been assaulted by some local troublemakers. We're going to extract him and assess the situation." Gonzalez didn't ask for additional details. Family emergencies involving commanding officers were handled with the same professionalism as any other mission, and questions about specifics could wait until they were airborne. Sergeant First Class Kevin O'Brien and Corporal Lisa Park joined them at the aircraft, both carrying tactical gear and sidearms. As the unit's rapid response team, they were accustomed to deploying quickly with minimal briefing, adapting to circumstances as they developed. "Sir, do we need additional backup?" O'Brien asked as he performed a quick weapons check. Sarah considered the question, Her father had mentioned a local group, which could mean anything from teenage troublemakers to organized criminals. Without more information, it was better to arrive prepared for multiple scenarios. Negative for now. We'll assess. Unseen and call for backup if needed. This is primarily an extraction mission. The Black Hawk's rotors began spinning as Thompson completed his abbreviated pre-flight checklist. The massive helicopter had been designed for military operations in hostile territory, equipped with advanced navigation systems and defensive capabilities that seemed like overkill for a domestic emergency. But Sarah had learned that overwhelming response often prevented situations from escalating into genuine emergencies. As the helicopter lifted off from Fort Indiantown Gap, Sarah used the flight time to gather more information about Elmwood Valley and potential complications they might encounter. The town was small enough that their arrival would be noticed immediately, which could either deter further trouble or escalate the situation depending on how the troublemakers reacted to military intervention. Back in the Blue Ridge Diner, Harold sat quietly with Rita while she fielded questions from other customers who had witnessed the morning's confrontation. The story was spreading through the diner's morning regulars, creating a buzz of outrage and concern that Harold found both touching and embarrassing. "Those bikers have been getting worse every week," Frank Morrison said, joining Harold and Rita at their booth. "Someone should have called the police when they started causing trouble. Police won't do anything unless someone files a formal complaint," Rita replied. "And who wants to be the one to make enemies of Tank Porter and his friends?" Harold listened to the conversation with growing understanding of how his situation had developed. The community had been watching Tank's group become increasingly aggressive, but had chosen to avoid confrontation rather than address the problem directly. Harold had simply been the unlucky target when Tank needed someone to victimize. Outside, the sound of approaching helicopter rotors began to penetrate the diner's windows, starting as a distant thrumming that gradually increased in volume and intensity. Conversation slowed as people tried to identify the source of the noise, which was unusual enough in Elmwood Valley to draw attention from anyone within hearing range. Harold smiled slightly, recognizing the distinctive sound of military aircraft long before anyone else in the diner understood what they were hearing. Sarah was coming, and she was bringing the kind of backup that Tank Porter had probably never encountered in his career of intimidating senior citizens. "That's a helicopter," Rita observed unnecessarily as the sound grew loud enough to rattle the diner's windows. "Yes," Harold agreed. "That would be my daughter." Rita stared at Harold with new understanding of what was about to happen on Main Street. A military helicopter responding to civilian trouble was unprecedented in Elmwood Valley's quiet history, but Tank Porter's assault on a veteran's father had apparently crossed lines that triggered responses beyond local law enforcement. The Black Hawk appeared over the tree line behind Murphy's Tavern, its dark silhouette unmistakable against the overcast sky. The aircraft circled the downtown area once, apparently searching for a suitable landing zone, before settling into a controlled descent toward the parking lot of the defunct textile mill 3 blocks from Main Street. Inside Murphy's Tavern, Emma Tucker watched the helicopter landing with growing concern for what it might mean for her business. Military aircraft didn't respond to minor disturbances, which suggested that the morning's confrontation between Tank and the elderly veteran had implications she hadn't considered. Tank himself stood in the tavern's doorway, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he watched uniformed personnel emerge from the helicopter and begin moving purposefully toward Main Street. Whatever response he had expected to his intimidation of Harold Stewart, military intervention had not been among the possibilities he had considered. Bobby Bishop joined Tank in the doorway, both men watching the tactical team approach with the growing realization that their target hadn't been as isolated and defenseless as they had assumed. "Tank," Bobby said quietly. "I think we might have made a mistake." Tank's jaw tightened as he watched the soldiers spreading out along Main Street. With the practiced efficiency of people who knew how to control a situation quickly and completely. For the first time since the confrontation began, Tank Porter found himself wondering who exactly Harold Stewart was and why his assault on an elderly veteran had triggered a military response. The answer to that question was about to walk through the front door of the Blue Ridge Diner, and Tank was beginning to suspect that he wasn't going to like what he learned. Colonel Sarah Stewart Gonzalez stepped out of the Black Hawk with the measured confidence of someone who had commanded emergency operations in far more dangerous locations than downtown Elmwood Valley. She wore standard military fatigues, with her rank insignia clearly visible, her bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Behind her, Master Sergeant Thompson and the tactical team spread out in a formation designed to secure the immediate area while maintaining a professional appearance that wouldn't unnecessarily alarm civilian bystanders. They moved with practiced efficiency, each soldier knowing their role without requiring verbal instructions. Sarah walked directly toward the Blue Ridge Diner, her pace neither hurried nor casual, but purposeful, in a way that suggested she was accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. Pedestrians along Main Street stopped to stare at the unusual sight of military personnel responding to what most had assumed was a minor local disturbance. Inside the diner, Harold watched through the window as his daughter approached, feeling a complex mixture of relief and embarrassment at needing to involve Sarah in his personal problems. Rita sat beside him with wide eyes, clearly struggling to reconcile the quiet elderly man she had served coffee to for 12 years with someone whose daughter commanded helicopter rescue operations. "Hal," Rita whispered, "you never mentioned your daughter was in the military." "Never seemed relevant," Harold replied quietly. "She has her life, I have mine. I try not to burden her with my problems." The diner's front door opened with its familiar chime, but the sound felt different when followed by the entrance of a uniformed army colonel, whose presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the building. Sarah scanned the interior quickly, her eyes finding Harold in the back booth and noting the bruise on his face with professional assessment. "Dad?" Sarah said, her voice carrying relief mixed with controlled anger as she approached his table. "Are you all right?" Harold started to rise from the booth, but Sarah motioned for him to remain seated while she sat down across from him. Her eyes conducted a rapid evaluation of his condition, noting the careful way he held himself and the slight swelling around his left cheek. "I've been better," Harold admitted, "but I'm glad you came." Sarah's expression hardened as she examined the evidence of her father's assault. "Tell me exactly what happened. Don't leave anything out." Harold recounted the events of the past week, starting with the initial encounter outside Murphy's Tavern and escalating through Bobby Bishop's harassment at the grocery store to the morning's public assault. Sarah listened without interruption, her military training allowing her to absorb the tactical information while her personal connection to the victim fueled a growing anger that she kept carefully controlled. "Where are the perpetrators now?" Sarah asked when Harold finished his account. Rita pointed toward the front window. "Most of them are still across the street at Murphy's Tavern. The leader's name is Tank Porter. Big guy with a beard and leathers. A vest." Sarah nodded and keyed the radio clip to her vest. "Thompson, I need eyes on Murphy's Tavern across the street. How many subjects are we looking at?" Thompson's voice crackled back immediately. 7 individuals visible, ma'am. 6 clustered around motorcycles, 1 in the doorway watching our position. No visible weapons, but leather clothing suggests motorcycle club affiliation. Copy that. Maintain observation but no direct contact until I give the word." Sarah turned back to Harold with the focused attention of a commander gathering intelligence. "Dad, did you file a police report about any of these incidents?" Harold shook his head. Didn't seem like it would help. Tank was careful not to do anything that would leave obvious evidence until this morning. This morning was witnessed assault, Sarah said firmly. Multiple witnesses, public location, clear evidence of injury. That's actionable regardless of his previous caution. Rita leaned forward, her maternal instincts overriding her usual reserve around strangers. Colonel, your father's been coming. Here for years. He's never caused trouble with anyone, never raised his voice or been anything but polite. What that man did to him was wrong. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she looked at Rita. Thank you for taking care of him. I appreciate you providing a safe place for him to wait. Of course, Rita replied. Hal's family here. We look out for family. The simple declaration seemed to affect Harold more than the morning's violence had, his eyes growing bright as he realized that his isolation in Elmwood Valley hadn't been as complete as he had believed. Rita's fierce protectiveness reminded him that community could exist even in places where it wasn't immediately visible. Sarah's radio crackled again. Colonel, we have local law enforcement approaching from the south. 2 patrol cars, no emergency lights. Copy. Stand down and let them approach. We're going to work with local authorities on this. Sarah looked at her father with the expression of someone making a command decision. Dad, I want you to file a formal complaint against Tank Porter for assault. I'll make sure you have proper support through the process. I don't want to cause trouble, Harold began, but Sarah cut him off with a gentle but firm gesture. He caused the trouble when he put his hands on you. This isn't about revenge. It's about preventing him from doing this to someone else who might not have a daughter with a helicopter crew. The front door of the diner opened again, admitting Deputy Chief Marcus Lane and Officer Jennifer Walsh. Both officers looked professionally curious about the military presence in their jurisdiction, though their demeanor suggested cooperation rather than territorial concern. Deputy Chief Lane approached Harold's table with the careful respect due to both a senior citizen and the family member of a military officer. Mr. Stewart, I'm Deputy Chief Lane. We received reports of an altercation this morning. Would you be willing to make a statement about what happened? Harold looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, I think I would. Lane pulled out a notebook and began taking Harold's statement, asking specific questions about times, locations, and witnesses. The process took nearly 20 minutes, during which Sarah observed the deputy chief's professionalism and thorough approach to documenting the incident. Mr. Stewart, Lane said when he finished writing, based on your statement and the witness accounts we've already gathered, there's sufficient evidence to arrest Mr. Porter for assault. Are you prepared to press charges? Harold felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Pressing charges would mean court appearances, legal proceedings, and continued involvement with Tank Porter, even after the immediate threat had been neutralized, but it would also mean taking a stand against the kind of intimidation that had been allowed to flourish in Elmwood Valley because no one was willing to challenge it directly. Yes, Harold said firmly. I'll press charges. Lane nodded and spoke into his radio, requesting additional backup for the arrest. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived on Main Street, their officers coordinating with Sarah's tactical team to ensure the arrest proceeded without complications. Sarah stood and looked out the diner window toward Murphy's Tavern, where Tank and his companions were clearly aware that their situation had changed dramatically. The presence of military personnel and multiple police cars had transformed their casual morning gathering into the focal point of a law enforcement operation. Sergeant O'Brien, Sarah spoke into her radio, I want you and Park to accompany the officers during the arrest. Observe only, no direct involvement unless requested by local law enforcement. Copy that, ma'am. Observing only. Sarah sat back down beside her father and took his hand in both of hers. Dad, this is going to get Complicated for a while. Court proceedings, media attention possibly. Are you prepared for that? Harold squeezed his daughter's hand, feeling stronger than he had since the confrontations began. I'm prepared. Someone needs to stand up to people like Tank Porter, and it might as well be me. Across the street, Tank Porter watched the coordinated law enforcement response with growing comprehension of how thoroughly he had miscalculated the consequences of his actions. The elderly man he had dismissed as a helpless target had connections that extended far beyond Elmwood Valley's quiet streets. Bobby Bishop stood beside Tank in Murphy's doorway. Both men, watching Officer Walsh and Deputy Chief Lane, approached their position with backup from Sarah's tactical team. Tank, what do we do? Tank's jaw worked silently as he considered his options. Running would only make things worse, and the military presence suggested that resistance would be futile. He had spent his adult life intimidating people he perceived as weaker than himself, but he had never faced consequences delivered by professionals trained to handle much more dangerous situations than motorcycle club posturing. We face it, Tank said finally. This is what happens when you pick the wrong target. Officer Walsh approached Tank with her hand resting casually on her service weapon, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had conducted hundreds of arrests. Jake Porter, you're under arrest for assault. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Tank looked once more at the diner where Harold Stewart sat with his Army Colonel daughter, finally understanding that some people carried protection that wasn't immediately visible. He turned around slowly and allowed Officer Walsh to place him in handcuffs, his resistance broken by the recognition that his victims weren't always as powerless as they appeared. As Tank was led toward the patrol car, Sarah's radio crackled one final time. Mom, subject is in custody. No resistance offered. Sarah nodded with satisfaction and turned back to her father. It's over, Dad. He won't be bothering you again. Harold watched through the window as Tank was placed in the back of a police car, feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness that the situation had required such dramatic intervention. But as he looked around the diner at Rita's protective concern and the supportive faces of other customers who had rallied to his defense, Harold realized that the morning's events had revealed strengths in his community that he hadn't known existed. Sometimes it took a crisis to show people who they really were. And Harold was pleased to discover that Elmwood Valley was better than he had given it credit for being. As the police car carrying Tank Porter disappeared down Main Street, an unusual quiet settled over Elmwood Valley. The remaining bikers stood, uncertainly around their motorcycles, their leader gone, and their group dynamics suddenly disrupted. Bobby Bishop looked lost without Tank's guidance, while the others exchanged nervous glances and began discussing whether they should leave or wait to see what happened next. Inside the Blue Ridge Diner, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something approaching celebration. Other customers who had witnessed the morning's events began approaching Harold's table, offering words of support and expressing regret that no one had intervened during the assault. Frank Morrison was the first to approach, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup tightly as he spoke. Harold, I owe you an apology. I saw what was happening out there, and I should have done something. That was cowardly of me. Harold looked up at the hardware store owner with understanding rather than judgment. It's not easy to know what to do in situations like that, Frank. I don't hold it against you or anyone else. Well, you should, said Susan Fletcher, the high school teacher who had been walking past during the assault. We all failed you this morning, every single one of us who saw what was happening and did nothing. Sarah observed these interactions with professional interest, noting how her father's gracious responses were helping the community process their collective guilt. Harold's ability to forgive was diffusing tension that might otherwise have created lasting divisions among neighbors. The important thing, Sarah interjected diplomatically, is that people are willing to speak up now. Dad's situation brought Attention to a problem that was affecting the whole community. Rita nodded emphatically. Those bikers have been getting more aggressive every week. Tank's been picking on anyone he thought couldn't fight back. Senior citizens, teenagers, women walking alone. Harold just happened to be the one where it finally went too far. Deputy Chief Lane returned to the diner after processing Tank's arrest, his expression showing satisfaction with how the situation had been resolved. "Mr. Stewart, I wanted to update you on the charges. We're filing assault in the 3rd degree based on the physical contact and public intimidation. With multiple witnesses and your willingness to testify, it should be a straightforward prosecution." "What about the others?" Harold asked, gesturing toward the window where Bobby Bishop and the remaining bikers were still gathered. "No charges against them for today's incident since they didn't participate directly in the assault. But we'll be keeping a closer eye on their activities going forward. Sometimes removing the leader changes the whole group's behavior." Sarah consulted her watch and spoke into her radio. "Thompson, what's our status for return to base?" "Ready?" "When you are, Mom. Aircraft secured and refueled. Weather's clear for departure." Sarah turned to her father with the careful expression of someone balancing professional duties with personal concerns. "Dad, I need to get back to base, but I don't want to leave you alone if you're not comfortable with the situation." Harold considered the offer, feeling tempted to accept protection, but recognizing that hiding behind his daughter's military authority wouldn't solve the underlying community problems that had allowed Tank's behavior to flourish. "I'll be fine, Sarah. This is my home and I can't run away every time there's trouble." "Are you sure? I can arrange for additional security if needed." "That won't be necessary," Harold said firmly. "Tank's in custody, and I think the message has been sent clearly enough that his friends will think twice before causing more problems." Rita leaned forward with maternal concern. "Hal, you're welcome to stay here as long as you want. I can drive. You home later if you'd prefer not to walk." Harold smiled at her kindness, but shook his head. "Thank you, Rita, but I think it's important that I walk home the same way I always do. Can't let fear change everything about how I live." Sarah studied her father's face with the analytical skills of someone trained to assess personnel under stress. Harold's color had returned to normal. His hands were steady, and his voice carried the quiet determination she remembered from her childhood when he faced difficult decisions with principled resolve. "All right," Sarah said finally, "but I want you to call me tonight and check in, and if there are any more problems, any at all, you contact me immediately." "I will," Harold promised. Sarah stood and embraced her father carefully, mindful of his injuries, but needing the physical connection to reassure herself that he was truly unharmed. "I'm proud of you, Dad, for standing up to them, for pressing charges, for not letting them break your spirit." "I had good teachers," Harold replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother taught me about courage, and you taught me about standing up for what's right." The goodbye took several more minutes, with Sarah giving detailed instructions to Rita about contacting her if Harold needed anything, and Harold assuring his daughter repeatedly that he was capable of managing his own affairs. Finally, Sarah walked out of the diner and rejoined her tactical team for the return flight to Fort Indiantown Gap. Harold watched through the window as the soldiers moved efficiently toward their helicopter. Their mission completed successfully, but their professional demeanor unchanged by the relatively peaceful resolution. Within minutes, the Black Hawk was airborne again, its rotor noise fading as it disappeared over the tree line. The departure of the military aircraft seemed to release tension that had been building throughout the morning. Conversations in the diner resumed their normal volume, and pedestrians on Main Street began moving with their usual casual pace rather than the heightened awareness that had characterized the past hour. Bobby Bishop and the remaining bikers held, A brief conference beside their motorcycles before mounting up and riding away from Murphy's Tavern without the usual display of revving engines and aggressive posturing. Their departure felt more like retreat than routine, suggesting that Tank's arrest had fundamentally altered the group's relationship with Elmwood Valley. Emma Tucker emerged from Murphy's Tavern and crossed the street to the diner, her expression showing concern mixed with business pragmatism. She entered and approached Harold's table with the careful deference of someone who had just discovered that a quiet customer possessed unexpected connections. "Mr. Stewart," Emma said, "I wanted to apologize for what happened outside my establishment. I should have intervened when I saw Tank harassing you." Harold looked up at the tavern owner with the same forgiveness he had shown the other bystanders. "You couldn't have known how far he would take it, Emma. I don't blame you for what happened." "Well, I blame myself," Emma replied firmly. "Tank and his friends won't be welcome at Murphy's anymore. I'd rather lose their business than have this a kind of trouble in my establishment." Rita smiled approvingly at Emma's decision. "That's the right choice, Emma. There are plenty of decent people who'll appreciate a place where they don't have to worry about being harassed." Emma nodded and returned to her tavern, while Harold finished his second cup of coffee and prepared to make the walk home. Several customers offered to accompany him, but Harold politely declined their escorts while expressing gratitude for their concern. "I'll walk with you part way," Rita announced, untying her apron despite the lunch rush that was beginning to develop. "My shift doesn't officially end for an hour, but I think they can manage without me." Harold started to protest, but Rita silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. "Hal Stewart, you've been looking out for yourself for 92 years, but today you're getting an escort whether you want one or not." They left the diner together, Rita's presence providing both security and companionship for the walk toward Maple Street. Other pedestrians they encountered offered nods and words of support, creating an atmosphere of community solidarity that Harold hadn't experienced since moving to Elmwood Valley. "Funny how crisis brings out the best in people," Rita observed, as they walked slowly toward Harold's neighborhood. "I've been serving breakfast to most of these folks for years, but I've never seen them come together like this. Sometimes it takes seeing someone get hurt to make people realize they're part of something bigger than themselves," Harold replied. "Tank did me a favor in a way by showing everyone what happens when a community stops looking out for each other." They paused at the corner of Main and Maple, where Harold Street branched off toward his small house. Rita hugged him carefully, mindful of his bruised ribs, but needing to express her affection and relief that he was safe. "You call me if you need anything, Hal, and I mean anything, even if it's just because you want company for dinner or someone to talk to. You're not alone in this town anymore." Harold thanked Rita and watched her walk back toward the diner before continuing down Maple Street toward home. The familiar route felt different now, not because of any physical changes, but because Harold's relationship with his community had been fundamentally altered by the morning's events. His small house welcomed him with its quiet comfort, but the isolation no longer felt oppressive. Harold knew that Rita would check on him, that Deputy Chief Lane would follow up on the legal proceedings, and that his daughter was only a phone call away if serious problems developed. As Harold settled into his favorite chair with the afternoon newspaper, he reflected on how dramatically his situation had changed in the space of a few hours. Tank Porter's assault had been intended to humiliate and isolate him further, but instead it had revealed sources of strength and support that Harold hadn't known existed. The bruise on his face would heal, and the legal proceedings would eventually conclude, but the connections he had forged with his community would remain. For the first time since Margaret's death, Harold felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was part of a network of people who cared about each other's welfare. Outside his kitchen window, the cardinal returned to his bird feeder, its bright red plumage, a splash of color against the grey afternoon sky. Harold watched the bird eat peacefully, knowing that tomorrow he would walk to the Blue Ridge Diner for breakfast, and Rita would be there to welcome him home. 3 weeks after Tank Porter's arrest, Harold Stewart received an unexpected letter in his mailbox. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was careful and deliberate, suggesting someone had taken considerable time with its composition. Harold carried the letter inside and settled into his kitchen chair before opening it with curiosity rather than concern. The letter was brief, written on plain notebook paper in the same careful script as the envelope. "Mr. Stewart," it began, "my name is Jake Porter. I wanted to write to you before my court hearing next week. I know an apology can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I understand how wrong I was. If you would be willing to meet with me, I would like the chance to explain myself and ask for your forgiveness in person. Respectfully, Jake Porter." Harold read the letter twice, then set it on the table beside his coffee cup while he considered its implications. Tank's request was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. The young man had 3 weeks in jail to think about his actions and their consequences, time that might have provided perspective on his behavior that wasn't available during the heat of their confrontations. Harold walked to his telephone and dialed the number for Deputy Chief Lane, who had become his primary contact with the legal system during the prosecution preparation. Lane answered on the second ring with the brisk efficiency Harold had come to appreciate. "Deputy Chief Lane speaking." "Chief Lane, this is Harold Stewart. I received a letter from Jake Porter asking to meet with me before his court hearing. Is this something that's allowed under the circumstances?" Lane paused before responding, clearly considering the legal and practical implications of such a meeting. "It's not prohibited, Mr. Stewart, but it's unusual. Defendants don't typically request face-to-face meetings with their victims before trial. What are your thoughts about it?" Harold looked at the letter again, trying to read between the lines for signs of manipulation or genuine remorse. "I'm not sure yet. Is there a way to arrange it safely if I decide I want to hear what he has to say?" "Absolutely. If you're interested, we can set up a meeting at the courthouse with a mediator present. Complete supervision. You can leave at any time, and nothing you discuss would affect the criminal charges. It's called victim-offender dialogue, and some people find it helpful for closure." Harold thanked Lane and promised to call back with his decision within a day or two. After hanging up, Harold walked to his front porch and sat in the rocking chair that had been Margaret's favorite spot for watching neighborhood activity. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the distant sound of children playing in nearby yards. Over the past 3 weeks, Harold's life had settled into a new routine that incorporated the changes brought about by Tank's assault and arrest. His Thursday breakfasts at the Blue Ridge Diner had become social events, with Rita and other regular customers engaging him in conversations that extended well beyond polite pleasantries. Frank Morrison had started stopping by Harold's house occasionally to check on his well-being, and Susan Fletcher had invited him to speak to her high school history class about his military service. The attention was gratifying, but also overwhelming for someone accustomed to privacy and solitude. Harold appreciated the community's newfound concern for his welfare, but he also missed the quiet anonymity that had characterized his first 12 years in Elmwood Valley. The assault had made him a local celebrity of sorts, which brought benefits, but also responsibilities he hadn't anticipated. That evening, Harold called his daughter to discuss Tank's letter and request for a meeting. Sarah listened carefully to his description of the situation before offering her perspective as both his daughter and someone familiar with military justice proceedings. "Dad, what do you hope to accomplish by meeting with him?" Sarah asked. Harold considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure, honestly. Maybe I want to understand why he chose me as a target." Maybe I want to see if his remorse is genuine or if he's just trying to improve his legal situation. Or maybe I'm curious about whether people can actually change when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Those are all valid reasons, Sarah replied. But you need to be prepared for the possibility that meeting with him won't give you the answers you're looking for. Sometimes people apologize because they're sorry they got caught, not because they've genuinely changed their perspective. I understand that risk, Harold said, but I keep thinking about what he said during our first confrontation about his father being damaged by military service. His anger wasn't really about me personally, it was about something much deeper. Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. That may be true, Dad, but his personal history doesn't excuse what he did to you. Don't let sympathy for his background cloud your judgment about his behavior. Harold assured his daughter that he would be careful and would make no commitments during the meeting that might complicate the legal proceedings. After they said goodbye, Harold spent the evening reading and thinking about Tank's letter, trying to understand his own motivations for considering such an unusual request. The next morning, Harold called Deputy Chief Lane and agreed to the mediated meeting. Lane scheduled it for the following Wednesday, 2 days before Tank's scheduled court hearing, with a trained victim offender dialogue facilitator present to ensure the conversation remained productive and safe. News of the planned meeting spread quickly through Elmwood Valley's close-knit community, generating mixed reactions from people who had witnessed Tank's assault and its aftermath. Rita expressed concern about Harold's emotional well-being, while Frank Morrison questioned the wisdom of giving Tank an opportunity to manipulate or intimidate Harold further. "Hal, that man hurt you," Rita said during Harold's Thursday breakfast. "At the diner. You don't owe him anything, certainly not the chance to make himself feel better by apologizing." "I'm not doing it for him," Harold replied calmly. "I'm doing it because I want to understand what happened and maybe prevent it from happening to someone else." Susan Fletcher, who had joined their conversation, nodded approvingly. "That's very mature of you, Harold. Restorative justice can be powerful when both parties approach it sincerely. I've seen students benefit from similar processes when they've caused harm to classmates." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with various diner customers offering opinions about Harold's decision to meet with Tank. The discussion revealed the community's ongoing struggle to process the events that had disrupted their quiet town's equilibrium and forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about their own responses to conflict. Wednesday morning arrived grey and cold, with the first hints of winter beginning to show in the bare tree branches and frost-covered grass. Harold dressed carefully for the courthouse meeting, choosing his best suit and the tie Margaret had given him for their 40th wedding anniversary. The formal attire felt appropriate for an occasion that demanded dignity and seriousness. Deputy Chief Lane picked Harold up at his house and drove him to the county courthouse, an imposing brick building that dominated the center of the county seat, 15 miles from Elmwood Valley. During the drive, Lane briefed Harold on the meeting's structure and reminded him that he could end the conversation at any time if he felt uncomfortable. The victim offender dialogue facilitator, Dr. Patricia Hoffman, met them in a small conference room furnished with a round table and comfortable chairs. Dr. Hoffman explained the process, emphasizing that the meeting was voluntary for both parties and focused on understanding rather than negotiation or forgiveness. "Mr. Stewart," Dr. Hoffman said, "I want you to know that Mr. Porter has been in counseling since his arrest, working with a therapist who specializes in anger management and trauma-related behavioral issues. This meeting is part of his therapeutic process, but it's entirely separate from his legal proceedings." Harold nodded his understanding as Tank Porter was brought into the room by a corrections officer. Tank wore orange jail coveralls and appeared to have lost weight during his incarceration. His beard had been trimmed short, and his overall appearance was subdued compared to the aggressive figure Harold remembered from their street confrontations. Tank sat across from Harold at the round table, his hands folded in front of him and his eyes focused downward. When he finally looked up, Harold saw exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse in his expression. "Mr. Stewart," Tank began quietly, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know you didn't have to do this, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly." Harold studied Tank's face, noting the absence of the hostility and arrogance that had characterized their previous encounters. "You said in your letter that you wanted to explain yourself. I'm listening." Tank took a deep breath before beginning. "My father was a Marine in Vietnam. He came home with what they didn't call PTSD back then, just problems that nobody knew how to fix. He drank, he had nightmares, he couldn't hold jobs. Our family fell apart because of what the war did to him." Harold listened without interrupting as Tank described growing up with an unpredictable father whose military service had become a source of pain rather than pride. Tank's narrative revealed a childhood shaped by fear, confusion, and misplaced anger at the military institutions that had seemingly broken his father's spirit. "I know that's not an excuse for what I did to you," Tank continued, "but I wanted you to understand that when I saw you in that army jacket, I wasn't seeing Harold Stewart. I was seeing everything I blamed for my father's suffering and our family's destruction." Dr. Hoffman gently guided the conversation, asking Tank to take responsibility for his choices, while allowing Harold to ask questions about Tank's motivations and current understanding of his behavior. The dialogue continued for over an hour, revealing depths of pain and confusion that Harold hadn't anticipated. "What I don't understand," Harold said finally, "is why you chose violence instead of trying to understand the difference between individual veterans and the institutions that sent us to war." Tank was quiet for a long moment before responding, because violence was easier than understanding. It let me feel powerful instead of helpless, angry instead of sad. But 3 weeks in jail gave me time to think about what I was really angry about, and it wasn't you or any other veteran. It was watching my father suffer and not being able to help him. The meeting concluded with Tank expressing genuine remorse for his actions, and Harold acknowledging the pain that had driven Tank's misguided behavior. Neither man offered immediate forgiveness or reconciliation, but both seemed to have gained understanding that might prevent similar conflicts in the future. As Harold left the courthouse with Deputy Chief Lane, he felt emotionally drained but oddly satisfied with the encounter. Tank's explanations didn't excuse his behavior, but they provided context that made the assault feel less personal and more like the tragic result of unaddressed trauma passing from one generation to the next. 6 months after Tank Porter's sentencing to community service and mandatory anger management counseling, Elmwood Valley had settled into a new equilibrium that incorporated the lessons learned from Harold Stewart's assault and its aftermath. The incident had become part of the town's collective memory, referenced in conversations about community responsibility and the importance of standing up for vulnerable neighbors. Harold's Thursday morning routine at the Blue Ridge Diner had evolved into an informal gathering that drew regulars seeking both Rita's excellent coffee and Harold's gentle wisdom about life, military service, and the art of aging gracefully. What had begun as a solitary meal had become a weekly forum for community members to connect across generational and social boundaries. On this particular Thursday in spring, Harold arrived at the diner to find an unexpected figure waiting at his usual table. Tank Porter sat quietly with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, wearing clean jeans and a plain blue shirt that made him look younger and less intimidating than Harold remembered. Tank's presence drew curious glances from other customers, but no one appeared alarmed or threatened by his appearance. Harold paused in the doorway, considering whether to approach his former antagonist or find seating elsewhere. Tank noticed his hesitation and half rose from the booth, his expression showing uncertainty about whether his presence was welcome. "Mr. Stewart," Tank said quietly, "I was hoping I could buy you breakfast this morning, if that's all right with you." Harold studied Tank's face, noting the absence of the aggressive posture and hostile expression that had characterized their previous encounters. The young man appeared genuinely nervous, like someone who understood the significance of the gesture. He was making and wanted desperately to get it right. "All right," Harold said finally, approaching the table with measured steps. "But I'll pay for my own breakfast. We can share the table." Tank nodded gratefully and sat back down as Harold settled into his usual spot across from him. Rita appeared almost immediately with coffee for Harold, her expression showing polite caution as she acknowledged Tank's presence. "Morning, Hal. Your usual?" "Please, Rita, and thank you." Rita took Tank's order for a simple breakfast and departed, leaving the two men to navigate the awkward terrain of their first voluntary conversation since the mediated meeting at the courthouse. Tank fidgeted with his napkin while Harold sipped his coffee and waited to hear what had prompted this unexpected encounter. "I know this is strange," Tank began, "me showing up here after everything that happened. But I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation at the courthouse, and I've been working on understanding why I was so angry all the time." Harold nodded encouragingly, but didn't interrupt, sensing that Tank needed to express thoughts he had been rehearsing for some time. "The counselor they assigned me has been helping me see how I was blaming individual veterans for things that weren't their fault. My father's problems came from how the government treated him when he came home, not from the war itself or the people who fought in it." "That's an important distinction," Harold agreed. "Soldiers don't make policy decisions about wars or how. Veterans are cared for afterward. We just do our jobs and try to come home in one piece." Tank's expression showed relief at Harold's understanding response. "Exactly. And I realized that attacking you was really me attacking my father in a way, like I was punishing him for being damaged by making other veterans suffer." The conversation continued as Rita served their breakfasts and other customers conducted their own morning business around them. Harold found himself impressed by Tank's insights into his own behavior and the genuine effort he was making to understand the psychological roots of his aggression. "What are you doing now?" Harold asked as they ate. "For work, I mean." Tank straightened slightly, and Harold detected a note of pride in his response. "I'm working at the VA hospital in the city. Started as a janitor, but they're training me for maintenance work. Fixing things, keeping the place running for veterans who need medical care." Harold's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's quite a change from motorcycle repair." The counselor suggested it. She said that making amends sometimes means changing the direction of your whole life, not just apologizing for past mistakes. "Working at the VA lets me do something positive for veterans instead of just feeling sorry about what I did wrong." The symbolism wasn't lost on Harold. Tank's decision to work at a veterans facility represented a complete reversal of his previous hostility toward military personnel, transforming his anger into service for the very population he had once victimized. "How do the veterans there respond to you?" Harold asked. Tank smiled ruefully. "Most of them don't know about my past, but the ones who do seem willing to give me a second chance as long as I do good work. There's an old Marine named Sergeant Rodriguez who's been teaching me about HVAC systems. He says everyone deserves the opportunity to prove they can change." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bobby Bishop, Tank's former lieutenant, in the motorcycle group. Bobby approached their table hesitantly, clearly uncertain about whether he was welcome to join them. Tank looked up at his former friend with an expression that mixed affection with regret. "Bobby," Tank said, "what brings you to the diner?" Bobby glanced nervously at Harold before responding. "I heard you were here, and I wanted to see how you were doing." Haven't seen much of you since you got out." Tank gestured to the empty space beside him in the booth. "Sit down. I'd like you to meet Harold Stewart properly. Mr. Stewart, this is Bobby Bishop. He was with me the day I made the worst mistake of my life." Bobby slid into the booth with obvious discomfort, his eyes avoiding direct contact with Harold. "Mr. Stewart, I owe you an apology too. I didn't hit you, but I stood there and watched Tank do it. I should have stopped him." Harold studied Bobby's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with the shame of remembered cowardice. "Thank you for saying that, Bobby. It takes courage to admit when we've failed to do the right thing." The three men sat together in a tableau that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The elderly veteran sharing breakfast with the men who had once terrorized him, engaged in honest conversation about responsibility, redemption, and the possibility of change. Rita observed their interaction from behind the counter, her protective instincts toward Harold warring with her recognition that something important was happening at table 6. Other customers occasionally glanced their way, but the conversation appeared peaceful enough that no one felt compelled to intervene. "What happened to the rest of the group?" Harold asked. Bobby answered quietly. "Fell apart after Tank got arrested. Most of the guys realized they were following someone who was leading them in the wrong direction. A couple of them moved away, others just stopped riding with us. I still have my bike, but I mostly ride alone now." Tank nodded sadly. "I'm sorry about that, Bobby. I know that group meant a lot to you." "It did," Bobby admitted, "but it wasn't worth being part of something that hurt innocent people. I'd rather ride alone than be involved in that kind of behavior again." Harold felt a moment of genuine sympathy for both young men, recognizing the loss of community and identity that had accompanied their moral awakening. The motorcycle group had provided belonging and purpose, even if it was ultimately destructive, and replacing it with healthier connections would take time and effort. "Have you considered finding a different kind of group to ride with?" Harold suggested. "There are veteran motorcycle clubs that do charity rides and community service. They might welcome people who want to use their bikes for positive purposes." Tank's eyes lit up with interest. "I didn't know there were groups like that. There are several in Pennsylvania. They raise money for disabled veterans, escort military funerals, participate in memorial events. It's a way to combine your love of motorcycles with service to others." The conversation continued for another hour, with Harold sharing information about veteran organizations and community service opportunities, while Tank and Bobby listened with growing enthusiasm. What had begun as an awkward encounter was evolving into something that resembled mentorship, with Harold helping his former antagonists find constructive channels for their energy and need for belonging. As they prepared to leave the diner, Tank stood and extended his hand to Harold. "Mr. Stewart, I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you, but I want you to know that meeting you changed my life. You showed me that veterans are real people with their own stories, not just symbols of something I was angry about." Harold shook Tank's hand firmly, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the slight tremor that suggested continuing struggle with his own demons. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Jake. What matters now is what you do with yours." Bobby also shook Harold's hand, his grip quick and nervous but sincere. "Thank you for giving us the chance to apologize properly, Mr. Stewart. I won't forget your kindness." As the two younger men left the diner together, Harold remained at his table with a fresh cup of coffee, reflecting on the unexpected turn his morning had taken. Rita joined him in the booth, her expression showing amazement at what she had witnessed. "Hal, I have to admit I was worried when I saw Tank sitting here waiting for you, but that was one of the most remarkable conversations I've ever overheard." Harold smiled at her concern. People can change, Rita. It doesn't happen often, and it doesn't happen easily, but it's possible when they're willing to do the hard work of understanding themselves. Do you really think Tank has changed? Or is he just saying what he thinks? You want to hear? Harold considered the question carefully before responding. I think his change is genuine, but it's also fragile. He'll need ongoing support and positive influences to maintain the progress he's made. That's why connecting him with veteran groups might be important. Rita nodded thoughtfully. It's generous of you to help him after what he did. It's not generosity, Harold replied. It's recognition that we're all connected to each other in ways we don't always understand. Tank's father was damaged by war, which damaged Tank, which led to him damaging me. Breaking that cycle requires someone to choose healing over revenge. As Harold walked home from the diner that morning, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since the morning 6 months ago when Tank Porter had struck him on Main Street. The assault had been traumatic and humiliating, but it had also catalyzed transformations that extended far beyond his own experience. The community of Elmwood Valley had discovered its capacity for solidarity and mutual support. Tank Porter had begun a journey toward understanding and redemption that might ultimately save him from a life of misdirected anger. Bobby Bishop had learned the importance of moral courage and the cost of passive complicity in wrongdoing. Harold's own life had been enriched by deeper connections with neighbors who had moved beyond polite acquaintance to genuine friendship and mutual care. His isolation had ended not through any effort of his own, but through the community's recognition that they had failed him and their determination not to repeat that failure. As he approached his house on Maple Street, Harold noticed a small American flag planted in his front yard, accompanied by a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for your service and your example." The flag hadn't been there when he left for breakfast, suggesting that someone had placed it while he was at the diner. Harold picked up the note and smiled at the anonymous gesture of respect and gratitude. The flag was small and simple, but it represented something larger. A community's recognition that dignity and honor didn't diminish with age, that service deserved acknowledgement regardless of how much time had passed since it was rendered. Inside his house, Harold placed the note on his kitchen table next to the morning newspaper and looked out his back window at the cardinal feeding at his bird feeder. The bright red bird had become a daily visitor, its presence a reliable source of simple beauty in Harold's carefully ordered world. The cardinal finished eating and flew away, but Harold knew it would return tomorrow, just as he would return to the Blue Ridge Diner next Thursday morning. Some routines were worth preserving, especially when they had been transformed from solitary habits into opportunities for community connection and mutual support. Harold Stewart had learned that dignity didn't retire, that courage could be quiet, and that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Most importantly, he had discovered that no one was ever truly alone, as long as they remained open to the unexpected kindness of others and willing to extend that same kindness in return. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.